the fate of an entire continent. A storm was moving toward Europe, a wave of conquest that had already crushed kingdoms and burned cities. On the edge of this rising tide, one army stood in its path, outnumbered, outmatched, but unbroken. Their leader was not a crowned emperor or a mighty king. He was a man known simply as the Hammer. On a cold autumn field, his army would face a force that seemed unstoppable. What happened there would shape the future of Europe and the world. If this army had fallen, Europe as we know it might never have existed. Its faith, its culture, its political destiny, all of it could have changed in a single campaign. For decades, the Umayyad Caliphate had moved like a flood, conquering lands from Arabia to North Africa, then crossing into Spain with breathtaking speed. One by one, cities fell, kingdoms collapsed. It seemed nothing could resist their advance. The crescent was advancing, and the cross was cornered. The stakes could not have been higher. This was not just another battle. It was the moment when the future of an entire civilization hung in the balance. By the end of this video, you'll understand why this single battle became a turning point in history, how one clash on a cold autumn day stopped an empire, changed the course of Europe, and echoed through the centuries. Don't miss it. In the early 8th century, a new power rose from the deserts of Arabia and spread with astonishing speed. The Umayyad Caliphate expanded across vast lands, moving from Arabia into North Africa, and then pushing westward toward the Atlantic. City after city fell before their armies, like dominoes collapsing one after another. Their advance was fast, organized, and relentless. Within just a few decades, they had crossed into the Iberian Peninsula, sweeping through Spain with incredible force. The Visigothic kingdom, which had ruled for centuries, crumbled in a matter of years. It was not just their military power that impressed the world. The Umayyads brought with them new systems of governance, culture, and faith. Their presence reshaped every land they entered. Then they set their sights north. Beyond the Pyrenees Mountains lay the lands of the Franks. Unlike the organized caliphate, Europe was fragmented and weak. There was no united France, no powerful empire to resist them. Instead, there were scattered kingdoms and tribes, divided by rivalry and struggling to survive. Borders shifted constantly, and rulers fought each other as much as they prepared to face outside threats. To many at the time, it seemed inevitable that the wave would continue. The storm was coming, and no one knew if anything could stand against it. Amid the rising tide of conquest, a leader was emerging in the north. His name was Charles Martel. He was not born into unquestioned power. In fact, he was the illegitimate son of a Frankish nobleman, a man whose claim to leadership was uncertain from the very beginning. Rivals surrounded him, ready to tear apart his fragile position. But Charles was not a man to be pushed aside. Through sharp political maneuvering, clever alliances, and military skill, he slowly strengthened his control. Step by step, he turned weakness into authority. Charles earned the name Martel, meaning the hammer, not because of noble blood, but because of the crushing force he brought to the battlefield. He was a commander who understood that power came not only from numbers, but from discipline, planning, and timing. While others relied on noble titles or luck, Charles built his strength through strategy. As the Umayyad forces moved deeper into Europe, Charles recognized the danger. He knew that if the Franks stood divided, they would fall one by one. So he began to rally the fractured Frankish territories under his leadership. Veterans hardened by tribal wars answered his call. Nobles pledged their loyalty. Even peasants were brought into the fold. Slowly, a scattered land began to unite behind a single cause. Charles was not blinded by pride. He understood his limits. He knew his forces were smaller than the invading army. But he also knew something else. If he chose the ground carefully and trained his men to hold their formation, they could blunt even the fiercest cavalry charge. It was this clear, disciplined vision that set him apart. The storm was coming, and Charles Martel was preparing to meet it head-on, not as a king with a crown, but as a hammer ready to strike. As summer faded into autumn, the two armies finally came face to face. On one side stood the vast Umayyad host, their banners fluttering in the cold wind, their cavalry restless and eager for battle. On the other side, positioned on high ground, Charles Martel and his Frankish warriors waited in silence. For days, neither side made the first move. Across the French countryside, thousands of campfires lit up the night like stars, scattered on the earth. The soldiers on both sides could see the glow of their enemies' fires, reminding them every moment that the storm was about to break. The Umayyad cavalry shifted constantly, their horses stamping the ground, snorting in the crisp air. They were used to swift victories, to charging across open plains and breaking their enemies within moments. But Charles refused to descend from his chosen ground. He stayed firm, unmoving, watching the enemy from his hilltop position. His patience was deliberate. Every day that passed allowed more of his reinforcements to arrive, while also stretching the enemy's supply lines. At night, the atmosphere grew heavy with a sense of fate. Monks in the Frankish camp prayed quietly, their voices rising in the cold wind. Warriors sharpened their blades by the dim firelight, whispering to one another about the battle to come. Some were afraid. Others were filled with a silent determination. All of them knew that what awaited them would decide far more than their own lives. The air was thick with something ancient, the kind of feeling that comes before great storms. Scouts clashed on the edges of the battlefield, testing each other's strength, but still the main forces held back. The Umayyad commander waited for Charles to make a mistake, to come down into the open, where cavalry could strike with devastating speed. Charles, however, would not be drawn out. He stood his ground, letting the tension grow heavier with each passing day. From a distance, it might have seemed like nothing was happening. But in reality, every hour of waiting was a strategic battle of wills. One side was growing restless, eager to attack. The other side, led by the hammer, was calm and focused, waiting for the perfect moment. The breath before impact stretched on, quiet yet full of hidden power. Everyone knew that when the storm finally broke, it would decide the future of Europe. When the waiting finally ended, it began with a sound like distant thunder. At dawn, the Umayyad cavalry surged forward, thousands of hooves pounding the frozen ground in unison. The earth itself seemed to tremble beneath their charge. Dust rose in thick clouds, banners snapped sharply in the wind, and the morning air filled with the roar of warriors shouting their battle cries. To anyone watching from afar, it must have looked unstoppable, a living wave of steel and muscle rushing toward the Frankish line. On the hilltop, Charles Martel's men stood in tight ranks, shoulder to shoulder, shields locked together. Spears bristled outward like a wall of thorns. They had no horses, no quick way to escape if the line broke. Their only choice was to hold. As the cavalry thundered closer, the Frankish soldiers tightened their formation, bracing for the impact. The first collision was brutal. The sound of hooves slamming into shields echoed like a drumbeat of war. Horses screamed as they crashed against the wall of spears. Riders swung curved swords downward, hacking at helmets and shoulders. Shields splintered under the force, men staggered, and some fell where they stood. For a moment, it seemed the line might break. But the discipline drilled into the Frankish ranks held firm. Fallen shields were replaced by those behind them. Gaps were quickly closed. The line bent under the pressure, but it did not snap. Frustrated, the cavalry pulled back and charged again. Then again. Wave after wave smashed against the shield wall like the sea against a rocky cliff. Each charge was met with the same wall of iron and wood, the same grim determination. Dust and blood filled the air. The battlefield became a blur of movement, horses rearing, men shouting, metal crashing. The Frankish infantry fought without elegance, but with relentless endurance. Every man knew that if one part of the line failed, the entire army could collapse. Hours passed in this brutal rhythm. Charge, clash, withdraw, charge again. The Umayyad cavalry, which had swept through Iberia like a storm, found itself stuck against an unyielding defense. Horses began to stumble over the bodies of the fallen. Riders were thrown to the ground, where Frankish axes and short swords found their targets. The shield wall was bloodied, splintered and exhausted, but it remained standing. Through the chaos, Charles Martel rode behind his lines, shouting commands and encouragement. His voice carried over the battlefield, calm yet forceful. He reminded his soldiers why they fought: for their homes, their faith, their families. His leadership anchored them as the storm raged around them. This was not a quick or glorious fight. It was a grinding test of endurance, fear and resolve. One side charged with overwhelming power, while the other stood firm, absorbing every blow. The clash of civilizations had truly begun, and the outcome would depend not on a single strike, but on which side could endure the longest. As the long and brutal day wore on, the battle seemed locked in a deadly stalemate. The Umayyad cavalry kept charging, and the Frankish shield wall kept holding. Both sides were exhausted. The field was covered with fallen men and horses, and the cold autumn air carried the smell of sweat, steel, and blood. It was then, in the middle of this grinding struggle, that a single rumor began to spread. One that would change everything. Somewhere on the edge of the battlefield, whispers ran through the Umayyad ranks. Their camp, far behind the front lines, was said to be under attack. Their baggage train, filled with the treasures and supplies they had gathered from their conquests, was in danger. For many of these soldiers, that treasure wasn't just loot. It was their payment, their reward for years of campaigning. Panic started to spread like wildfire. At first, it was only a few riders who looked back nervously. Then more began to hesitate. The tight cavalry formations that had charged so confidently in the morning now wavered. Some riders broke away completely, galloping toward the camp to protect their wealth. Others hesitated, torn between obeying their commander and securing their future. Discipline, which had held firm through countless battles, began to fracture under the weight of fear and greed. Charles Martel saw it. From his position on the hill, he noticed the hesitation rippling through the enemy lines. He had waited patiently all day, absorbing every assault. Now the moment he had prepared for was here. Like a blacksmith striking a red-hot blade, the hammer chose his time. He ordered his men to push forward. The Frankish infantry, though tired and bloodied, surged with sudden energy. They advanced down the slope with their spears and axes, slamming into the gaps left by the wavering cavalry. Shouts of triumph rose as they sensed the shift. The once unbreakable rhythm of the Umayyad assault was now broken. The psychological blow was devastating. The cavalry that had once seemed unstoppable was now scattered and confused. Abdul Rahman, their commander, tried desperately to regain control, shouting orders and rallying his men. But the damage was done. The unity of his army had been cracked, not by swords, but by fear of losing their treasure. Charles had waited, patient and deliberate, through hours of brutal combat. Now he struck with precision. This was the turning point. The tide of the battle was shifting, and for the first time that day, the mighty Umayyad force began to falter as the chaos spread through the Umayyad ranks. Their commander, Abdul Rahman al-Ghafiqi, rode among his men trying to restore order. He shouted commands above the clash of steel, his curved sword flashing as he moved through the confusion. For years, he had led his forces to victory across mountains and rivers, but now he faced something far more dangerous than any enemy: panic within his own army. Cavalry formations broke apart, riders argued. Some fled toward the camp, while others hesitated on the field. Abdul Rahman pushed himself into the thick of it, determined to hold his army together. But in the middle of the swirling battle, fate caught up with him. Accounts differ on how it happened. Some say he was struck by a Frankish axe. Others, that a spear pierced him during the confusion. What is certain is this: Abdul Rahman fell on that battlefield. The moment news of his death spread, the fragile balance within the Umayyad army shattered completely. For many of his men, he was not just a commander. He was the anchor that held their massive force together. When he died, their hope died with him. Panic turned to full retreat. Riders who had hesitated now turned their horses and fled. Units that had once charged with confidence now scattered in every direction. The great Umayyad host that had crossed continents began to dissolve before the eyes of the Franks. What had started as a proud, unstoppable advance ended in confusion and fear. Charles Martel saw victory within his grasp, but he did not let triumph make him reckless. He held his men together, keeping their formation strong. He knew that battles could be lost in the chaos of pursuit just as easily as they could be won in defense. Instead of chasing the fleeing cavalry into the night, he secured his position. The Franks stood firm, claiming the field as their own. As the sun set, a deep silence fell over the battlefield. The cries of the wounded faded into the cold night air. Banners that once flew proudly now lay scattered on the ground. Abdul Rahman's body was among the fallen, his ambition buried with him. The Umayyad dream of pushing deep into Europe had died with its commander. The hammer had not only held the line, he had broken the storm. When dawn broke the next morning, the battlefield lay silent. The Frankish soldiers stood among the wreckage of a night that had changed history. The bodies of men and horses covered the fields. Broken shields, shattered spears, and torn banners were scattered everywhere. The cold morning air carried the smell of smoke, iron, and death. Yet amid the destruction, one thing was clear: the Franks had held their ground. The mighty Umayyad army, which had swept across continents, had vanished into the night. Charles Martel moved carefully, not as a reckless conqueror, but as a commander who understood the weight of what had happened. He gathered his weary men, secured the field, and refused to be lured into any traps. Abdul Rahman's body was found among the fallen, a silent reminder that the storm, which had threatened to reshape Europe, had been turned back. The Umayyads would never again push so far north. Their advance had been stopped. For the Franks and for Christendom, this victory became more than just a military success. It was a turning point. Charles Martel's triumph cemented his authority over the Frankish lands, laying the foundation for the Carolingian dynasty. From his line would come Charlemagne, the man who would shape medieval Europe and be crowned Emperor of the Romans. Historians still debate the scale of the Umayyad threat, arguing whether they truly intended to conquer all of Europe or were simply raiding for wealth. But for the people who stood on that field in 732, there was no doubt. They believed they had saved their world. Medieval chroniclers would later write of this clash as the moment the hammer struck down the crescent, preserving the cross and the fragile identity of a continent. The Battle of Tours was more than just a fight between two armies. It was a collision of faiths, of cultures, of destinies. One side carried the momentum of empire, the other the weight of survival. And against all odds, the smaller, disciplined force stood firm. The storm had come, and it had broken on the hill where Charles Martel and his men refused to yield. The echo of that autumn day would shape Europe for centuries to come. The Battle of Tours was not just a clash of swords and shields. It was a moment when the future of a continent stood on the edge of a blade. One leader's patience, strategy, and discipline turned what seemed inevitable into an enduring victory. From that day forward, the course of European history changed forever. If you've enjoyed this journey into one of history's decisive moments, make sure to like the video, share it with others who love epic history, and subscribe for more powerful stories from the past. By the end of this video, you've seen how a single battle reshaped civilizations, and there are many more turning points waiting to be explored. Hit the bell icon so you never miss the next story.